What is the source of this prison's near century of paranormal claims?
Who is the Shadow Man, and what makes his presence so terrifying?
What dark history lingers in this infamous underground sugar shack?
Find out the answers to these questions and more as we uncover the terrifying hauntings and history from West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Erica.
And this is The Haunted Atlas, a Haunted U.S. podcast.
In the interest of fully exploring history of certain locations, the Haunted Atlas may discuss sensitive or disturbing topics. Listener discretion is advised.
With 24-foot-tall walls and battlements reminiscent of a medieval era, the West Virginia Penitentiary's menacing exterior hints at its storied past. With a history of violence and riots, the story of this penitentiary does leave you asking, what is more startling, the history or the paranormal activity? West Virginia State Penitentiary was built in the mid to late 1800s, and it was finally completed in 1876. It was inspired by a similar prison in Joliet, Illinois. And in fact, it's almost a perfect copy of that prison, just slightly smaller. Okay. Well, half the size.
Oh, wow. Okay, so a lot smaller.
Yeah, a lot smaller. The building began with the North Wagon Gate, and they used a prison labor system to complete much of the original construction.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so the prisoners were literally building the penitentiary and living in it.
It makes sense, right? But also kind of sad.
Yeah, it's an inexpensive way to do it.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why it shouldn't be surprising, but it kind of is, to think about them building their cells, literally.
Yeah. And the population there was actually 250 male inmates. So there was a lot of people to complete this labor.
Yeah.
There was also separated designated spaces for the warden, of course, and for some female inmates if needed.
Okay.
The early days of the penitentiary were considered some of the best in its history, despite the fact that it was all built using labor.
Right.
Prisoners had designated jobs, and the population was a good size for the actual size of the prison. There was no overcrowding, and in fact, the prison was fully self-sufficient through this inmate labor system.
Oh, okay. Being able to have a job probably helps with the daily routine of these individuals, because I'm sure at least then they're out of their cells and about doing things for the day.
Right. That's something I was thinking. And I don't know much about the dynamics, but I would think that working with your fellow prisoners and maybe even working alongside some external people really would create a sense of community there. Like, look at what they've all built together.
And the fact that it's not overcrowded. A lot of these penitentiaries, sanatoriums, public places tend to get overcrowded, and that's where problems can start, truly.
I agree. I'm not trying to say, oh, this is a great penitentiary, but
right. As
far as they go, it is nice that there was no overcrowding.
Yes.
And some inmates were even able to work for profit of the prison, not themselves. Mm-hmm. But this allowed extra money and time for prisoners to do extracurriculars like put on plays.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so they did have some benefits that went along with this work.
Yes.
In 1921, the prison opened its own coal mine, which led to it being further profitable. It operated almost entirely without state funds at this time.
Was it using labor from the prison still?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, conditions were worsening and the financial state was improving. Those two don't really go together.
Yeah, actually, that's a really fair point. I didn't even think about that.
That's where you can start to get some resentment, I think. When everybody was working together, there wasn't overcrowding. Maybe it could lead to better moods, but when everybody's still working hard, bringing more income, conditions are worsening, then you're going to run into issues.
Yes, and we're in the 1920s now, right? So you would hope as time goes on, they understand how to better serve these penitentiaries and have better conditions, but
they did not.
Yeah.
By the 1930s, the state consolidation efforts resulted in an influx of inmates to this specific penitentiary. So they were now sleeping 3 to a cell, which is drastically different from how it originally was.
Yes. And did they end up using the women's ward as well? As I'm assuming at that point, they just kind of tossed everyone wherever they could.
Yeah, I'm assuming it was absolutely filled to the brim. And at this point in the mid-30s, the Depression is in full swing. So there's not more money coming down the line.
Right.
They needed expansion desperately, but any expansion efforts in general that weren't related to the war were very slow because all of the building materials that were needed were prioritized for World War II. The actual expansion wasn't finished until 1959 because of the rations that had to do with the war. So that's a long time for prisoners to be sleeping 3 to a cell and packed in. That's 30 years.
Yeah.
And again, conditions in the United States weren't great at this time anyways because we did have the Depression, but this is where they were getting terrible.
Right.
When you have that many people, you're bound to have issues with the way that things are running, sanitation, etc.
Even just interactions between people themselves, you know?
Absolutely.
Of course, like you had mentioned, moods are going to go down as soon as this overcrowding starts.
Yeah, no private space, no space at all. I can definitely see it causing issues. And conditions continued to worsen because the plumbing systems could not handle the amount of prisoners that they had. So there was issues with plumbing, there was bug infestations, and at this time, security was also getting frustrated and more relaxed with how they were caring for the inmates. They had a lot of new inmates coming in and a lot more people to supervise.
And it's surprising to me that they did not hire more guards, but it sounds like they did not.
I think with the budget cuts, they just really couldn't afford.
Yeah.
This continued. So that was in the 1960s that those conditions were worsening. In 1979, 15 inmates were able to escape and in the process actually killed a state trooper.
Oh, no.
This finally got some attention for the prison, which I'm not saying this is why the inmates did it, but it's attention that the inmates wanted because they wanted the outside world to know how deplorable the conditions had gotten.
Yeah.
In 86, the prison got additional attention when prisoners rioted on New Year's Day in response to a burst sewer pipe. So this is from 1959 to 1986, and we're still having plumbing issues. That's many, many years. And imagine if you were there for a long time, having these chronic issues where you live. It must be so incredibly frustrating because you can't do anything yourself to fix them.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I was speechless for a second. I was trying to figure out what my reaction really was, but that's just horrific and terrible conditions. And you're right. What if someone's in there for a life sentence? So they're just stuck.
Absolutely. Because it was New Year's Day, many officers were off for the holiday. So they were running on a bit of a skeleton crew. Because of this, 20 prisoners were able to take hostages.
Oh, no.
None of the hostages were killed, but the prisoners demanded a new cafeteria be built, and the state wasn't really in a position to disagree at that point.
Right.
So they eventually agreed to the new cafeteria. The prison just couldn't really recover from the 70s and 80s being so terrible, and then there was the final blow. The West Virginia Supreme Court ruled that the cells that they had were a cruel and unusual punishment. So you might be thinking, what are these cells? They were 5 by 7 feet.
What?
Yes. So think back to the 3 people sharing a 5 by 7 foot cell.
Oh my goodness. That's not even half of what one person would need, to be honest.
Yes, it's much, much smaller than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
Because of this ruling, the prison could either modify the cells or cease operation. It had been a long time coming that they didn't have money to make the upgrades and expansions that were needed and wanted. So finally, in 1995, after 119 years of operation, 94 executions, and 36 murders, the prison finally closed.
Which, if you think about it, the whole situation is really messed up because they had an influx of prisoners, and from then on, it was just completely overcrowded, right? And now they're at a point where they have to close, but all of those prisoners now need to get put somewhere else. And instead of there now being an option of at least some of them remaining in this building, and again, totally glad that they shut this down because obviously conditions were so terrible. But now all of these individuals are being sent to other places that may not be able to handle influx there.
Absolutely. It seems like a domino effect problem.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure how you solve it.
No.
After it closed, it actually sat empty for many years, which is interesting to me. I suppose, what does one do with a prison?
Right.
5 years later, in 2000, MTV's Fear contracted ownership with the hopes of filming a pilot there. The pilot then kickstarted the reputation of the prison as being extremely haunted, and the lore has only grown. I think when you have a place that has this much negativity surrounding it, it makes sense that with strong emotional reactions, there could be ties here.
Yes, definitely.
It's unsurprising that to this day, it is still known as one of the most popular paranormal locations in the country. Let's explore the hauntings of West Virginia Penitentiary. They actually go back almost 100 years. So imagine, it's the 1930s. You're a night shift guard that's here at West Virginia Penitentiary. And you see what you believe to be inmates walking around the yard or even off-limits area. Your natural response would be to report this.
Right.
So they were reporting these things. They signaled alarms, which would launch whole investigations of the property, making sure that the inmates were in their cells, no one had escaped, looking at these areas, but inmates were never found.
I completely forget when the first 15 individuals escaped from the penitentiary. However, if this had been going on since the 1930s, is it possible that some guard did see the 15 individuals escaping and then kind of contributed that to the fact that people had been reporting seeing inmates for years?
That's actually not a bad idea because this is 45 years before the escape.
Okay.
So that very much so could be possible. If there was that culture of, people see these shadowy inmates escaping, they just don't want to be the boy that cried wolf again.
Exactly.
I did not even consider that. And this really kicked off the history of reports of shadow figures throughout the complex, which are one of the most common reports.
Mm-hmm.
One notable figure is the Shadow Man. He is actually still seen today, so he has a long history there, 95 years almost.
Oh my gosh.
He commonly stands in areas that are already shrouded in shadows, which means it can be hard to see him.
Mm-hmm.
He's associated with an intimidating presence, with some people say that they just sense that he's there. I think this is a really interesting presentation because shadow figures, I can already be very skeptical of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think you really have to look at how the light's playing, how are you seeing them, are they captured on image? But when we do capture them or see them, in my opinion, they're often moving.
Yeah.
So to just stand there intimidating people, that's a bit of a different presentation. It's almost like a Hatman presentation to me.
Yes.
There's actually a very famous photo that was taken of the Shadow Man, and it's taken in the hallway looking down towards the cafeteria. It was taken by Polly Gear, who is the co-founder of the Mountaineer Ghosts Paranormal Investigators. The photo was taken in 2004 around 1:30 a.m., and it was notably just after a thunderstorm had hit the area. And you can distinctly see the figure at the end of the hall.
Yeah. So 2 things about this. First, that hallway itself is very eerie, just in general. The second thing, it is interesting to me that he's presenting in front of the cafeteria because that was the demands of the inmates,
Yes.
that they get a new cafeteria, right? So I'm wondering if there's any connection or significance between that.
I agree. I think it's really interesting how he seems to just show up as an intimidating presence. I think when you hear intimidating presence in penitentiary, you so often can think guard, but I'm wondering if he was one of the leads of the prison riots.
I didn't even think about the fact that it could have been a guard, but also that would explain the standing still because they had posts.
Well, yeah, but I'm leaning more towards your theory of the prison riots now. Maybe he was keeping watch on the door, or he's just standing as an unmoving force because he has demands and they will be met.
Yeah.
I think things like this are such a cool capture for the paranormal community.
Yes.
She gives details on the photos. She says she first saw the man when she was 10 feet from him and then backed away. And she was about 110 feet, she estimates, when she took the photo.
So she saw this figure and was able to get a picture of it.
Yep.
Because in my head, I'm thinking she took the picture and then looked and said, oh my goodness, there's someone here. That is crazy.
Yeah. So she had the wherewithal to see it, back away, and then turn around and take the photo.
Nope. I would maybe walk towards it thinking it was another person if we were like in a public investigation with other people, or B, run the heck away, like in the opposite direction without even thinking maybe I should capture this in some form.
Maybe we should like strap a camera to you then.
Video like a GoPro?
Camera. Yes.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea.
If you're running, we can see what you're running from.
Yeah.
I just think it's amazing and such a notable photo.
Yes.
One of the locations in this penitentiary that's known to be very haunted is the Sugar Shack. This building was a wintertime recreational room for inmates, but it was actually used for illicit activities like gambling, drugs, sexual assaults, and fights. Visitors today report that you can still hear loud arguing if you're in the Sugar Shack.
Right.
Potentially creepier, you can sometimes hear very quiet disembodied whispers.
Oh, yeah, that would definitely freak me out a little more, I think, than hearing actual voices arguing.
I agree. I think the idea that two spirits might be arguing with each other there or replaying an argument or a fight in their head is more comforting than the fact that there's a spirit there just whispering very quietly at me.
Yes, definitely. And it makes sense to me that this room is one of the most haunted because I think this is probably where inmates could relax the most out of the entire place. And so if any of them are returning to this place in their afterlife, maybe not even by want, of course not by want. If any of them are kind of stuck here, of course that's the room that they're going to go to.
I agree. I think there's high emotionality in this room with all of the things that occurred here. Even gambling, that's a high emotion thing to have occurring.
Yes.
So it makes sense we see spirits tied to locations with high emotionality. There's also cold spots that are frequently reported in this space, but you do have to remember it's an old prison.
Right.
So I always take those with a grain of salt, unless they can be associated with something else.
Right.
If you see the shadow man in a cold spot, I'll give it to you.
Yes, that I can believe.
Another noteworthy paranormal spot is the North Wagon Gate, which was the first completed structure.
Yes.
Yes, built with inmate labor.
Right.
The gate was actually used for hangings.
Oh, no.
Yeah, plot twist.
Yeah.
It's no surprise that this area is haunted, given that.
Not. Whenever we have studied and researched penitentiaries, if there are gallows, that seems to be a place where every single one we've looked into has had activity.
Yeah, I think with so much traumatic death happening there, it
Yes.
just makes sense that the spirits could have unresolved business, especially if people were innocently hanged.
Yes. And you said 36 executions?
There were 36 murders. There were 94 executions on site.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yes. This area is known to be haunted by one specific spirit, Orville Adkins, and he suffered, unfortunately, a botched execution.
Oh, no.
Yes. The year was 1938, and EVPs have been captured of Adkins' disembodied voice. Visitors report an overall uncomfortable feeling here, and some have even heard footsteps pacing back and forth, which many attribute to be Adkins himself.
Yeah. The discomforting feeling, that could be paranormal, for sure, but also could be because of just because of the history.
I agree. I think it makes sense to feel uncomfortable when you're standing in an area that was used for executions.
Right.
And also when you're standing in this historical penitentiary, there's an overall eerie feeling.
Yeah.
So I agree. But the footsteps and the EVPs that have been captured definitely give credit to Adkins being there.
Right. And I'm wondering what the EVPs are saying. I'm curious to know what is happening with him.
Right. I think there's so much more to be said if you could piece together his story a little bit better.
Yes.
Why is he there? I mean, probably because of his botched execution, but...
Right.
North Hall is also on the campus and known to be haunted. The hall used to house the most violent offenders, and paranormal investigators have reported a whole slew of abnormalities here. There are photographic anomalies, and some people have actually even reported catching apparitions on camera.
Which is huge.
Yes.
Normally you get orbs, normally you might see an orb and you have to debunk if the lighting was weird, but to see a full apparition and to have that be a common occurrence.
Absolutely. Equipment does tend to malfunction in this area, so it can be challenging to get those types of photos. batteries drain quickly, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Visitors also report hearing the sound of cell doors slamming. I'm always hesitant with doors opening and closing, especially in old buildings that could settle. But we do know people that have been here, and they have confirmed that the doors are very, very heavy and would not slam on their own.
Okay.
So given that, I think it adds credence to the haunting. And the severity here is key to me. The door is slamming. Opening and closing would be one thing, but a heavy cell door completely slamming, there's force behind that.
Yes.
That's not the wind. Wind is not pushing an iron door shut.
No, definitely not.
If it was sagging architecture, I would think all of the doors would slam immediately and not open back up.
Right.
But if you're doing an investigation in an area, you haven't had doors slam, no one has touched the doors, and a door slams, that would be linked to paranormal, in my opinion.
Yes.
Because nothing else, no other force is acting upon that door.
Right.
One inmate is specifically known to haunt this area. His name is Red Snyder. He was actually killed by other inmates, being stabbed a total of 37 times.
Oh my goodness.
Remember, there were a number of murders that happened in the history.
Right.
So this is one of them. People say that he creates a generally uneasy feeling and is actually known to sometimes grab people as they walk by. I have a theory here. What if he's grabbing them for help?
That's a really great theory.
I think people often think of spirits as if they're grabbing you, it's negative or something, they're trying to pull you in.
Yeah.
But I think here it could definitely be for help.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting that you say that because I had the same thought when we were talking about Orville. When I said, I'm wondering what the EVPs are saying, I think there's a possibility that he's not just mumbling or being angry. There's a possibility he's asking the person there for help.
That's a great point. Or even for an explanation.
Yes.
You know, what really happened?
Yeah.
He probably wants to know.
Right.
So I think that's another reason it's important to know the history and really consider that when you're dealing with these spirits. These used to be people. What happened in their life? What is informing their behaviors in their afterlife?
Right.
While, of course, there are all of these haunted locations that are really well known, the whole complex is essentially said to be haunted. Some of the hauntings covered at specific sites also occur throughout the prison.
Okay.
So things like cold spots, shadow figures, and disembodied voices are reported in many locations. Some of the places that have these phenomena are the chapel, the psych ward, and the shower cages.
Interesting. I wonder what that could signify.
I think they all have their own significance, and they're reported at many other locations. I picked these three because I think they each have their own significance. I think the religious ties of the chapel make it a place of, again, emotionality.
Right.
The psych ward, of course, is going to have some tension there, I would assume, some probably maltreatment. And then the shower cages, I think, makes sense because it's a place of intense vulnerability.
Yeah.
So if anything were to go wrong, fights, etc., you feel very vulnerable there.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's also interesting because instead of thinking of these hauntings as stationary, if we think of them as spirits that move around and the people that they were, you can consider that if the shadow figure is appearing in the cafeteria, for example, I'm not saying necessarily the shadow man, but the shadow figure is in the cafeteria, if they're going throughout their day, they could also be in the chapel. They could also be in the shower cages.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that the spirits that are here are moving throughout the complex.
Oh, I agree. Because showers can be a place of vulnerability, like you said. They can also be a place of solace. I don't know if, as they're walking around the building, that's a place that they can go and feel like at least I have some kind of not privacy, but time away from their cell, time away from the guards.
Yeah. And I mean, to get a shower, that is an act of self-care.
Yeah.
Visitors also report strange and unpleasant odors throughout the building. That can go here or there to me. This is a very, very old building. What is the unpleasant odor?
Yes, because the conditions were also not great by the end.
Right.
So probably not a lot of cleaning going on at the end.
Yes. And if it's not abandoned, but it's not run as a prison. So are there mice there that have died? Things like that, I think, could contribute to this unpleasant scent.
Yes.
Plus, we know that odors can be held in fabrics, wood, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So that I take with a grain of salt. While it might seem like the ghosts here are primarily prisoners, there have actually been some spirits of guards reported. The apparitions have been seen doing patrols and even walking through walls. And I do think, again, it's important to note that some of the more general hauntings could be guards. You have to think of anyone that could be at this prison. It actually isn't even limited to guards and prisoners. It could be cleaning staff, medical staff that were there, maybe social workers that were coming on site and had intense emotional ties.
Yes.
So rather than thinking of it as prisoners, guards in the afterlife, I think you have to consider that these hauntings could have a lot more facets to it.
Yes.
And that's why investigation and figuring out who the spirits are is so interesting. The cold spots, voices, slamming, etc., those could actually all be guards, for all we know.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, that maybe, like you said, more of the general hauntings were these guards that had walked around, because, of course, there are significant inmates of things that have happened to them. But in this particular penitentiary, it doesn't seem like there was a significant case of a guard dying or a guard going through something traumatic. So it could just be they're just kind of generally there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to think about what the haunting is when trying to figure out who it is.
Yeah.
For example, prisoners slamming a cell door shut seems unlikely to me versus a guard slamming a cell door shut.
Yes. In my head, I didn't say it at the time, but in my head, I did think that was more of a guard behavior.
Right. Why would you want to shut yourself or your fellow inmate in?
Right.
Especially in a 5x7 cell.
Right.
This place is incredibly popular in the paranormal community and has been featured on a number of TV shows. It's been on MTV's Fear, as I mentioned, but also Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures, Most Terrifying Places in America, and the Science Channel's Mysteries of the Abandoned and Sci-Fi's Ghost Hunters.
The Mysteries of the Abandoned would be an episode I would really be interested in.
Yeah, it's the name of the series, and it's by the Science Channel, which I think is interesting.
Yes, that's what draws me in. What draws me in, that it's by the Science Channel. That's really cool.
I love that it's such a variety of channels that are having it. MTV, Travel Channel, Science Channel, Sci-Fi.
Right.
I love when paranormal becomes so widespread.
Yes, I agree.
If you have been to West Virginia Penitentiary, we would love to hear your story. You can email the team at hauntedus.com and include Haunted Atlas Episode 8 in the subject, or you can find us on Instagram at hauntedus and send us your story there. Tune in to our upcoming episode to see the next place where we drop the pin on our adventures across the haunted US. This episode of the Haunted Atlas was presented by Sarah Sweeney and Erica Barrett. It was researched by Sarah Sweeney, supported by research from Haunted US head writer Mitch Gott, with production assistance by David Sweeney. Our executive producer is Brandon Rugsey. Haunted Atlas is a production of Haunted US. Visit hauntedus.com for more information.